So I might get underway in the interest of time. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marion Fulker. I'm the CEO of the Committee for Perth. Welcome to Committee for Perth members. Today we also have guests and we have members of the media as well joining this first in our Lunch and Learn series of webinars. We're pleased to be launching the results of the 2021 Perth Perception Survey, which was done by our market research partner Ipsos, long-term colleagues of ours. And this is the 2021 results, but we have actually been commissioning the survey since 2012. In opening today's event, can I acknowledge that here in Perth we're meeting on Whadjuk country, part of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to also any Aboriginal people joining the webinar today. The benefit of joining live in person is that you'll also be able to pose some questions to Sally, and I look forward to the Q&A following her presentation. So the webinar will run for 60 minutes. Sally's presentation runs for about 25, and then I'll moderate a Q&A. Our staff are monitoring all of the technology in the background, so please don't hesitate to drop something into the chat in case you're having any difficulties, or call the office if it really is dreadful. And you're all muted so that we don't have any background noise. And just as questions come to mind, pop them into the Q&A, and that's where I will take them from, and we will work through them later in proceedings. So can I introduce to you Sally Braidwood? Committee for Perth members would know her very well. Sally is the Director of Ipsos Corporate Reputation for the APAC region and specialises in helping clients manage and track their reputations amongst stakeholder audiences. Within Ipsos's global business that spans more than 90 countries, and Sally is part of a senior team of global reputation experts who are at the forefront of reputation best practice and thought leadership. Sally holds a Bachelor of Laws and a Master's of Business Research, a foundation that enables her to deliver strategic business advice based on empirical evidence, and she works closely with boards, executive teams and listed and private sector clients at local, regional and global level, and has been collaborating with us for many years. So Sally, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I'll just start sharing the presentation. Technology has been kind to us this morning so far, so there's no reason that won't continue. Hopefully that has come through for you all. Really pleased to be here to join you all today to share the results of the 2021 Perth Perception Survey. As Marianne mentioned, we've been running the study since 2012, and it's every 3 years that the research is conducted. Always interesting. We always really look forward to these studies to see what's different about life in Perth. You know, as Marianne mentioned, I work in the region, but I love living in Perth, and, you know, from a personal perspective, always so keen to see what's shifting and what's changing here in Perth. So we speak to residents. We also have data from members, but we're going to focus on the residents' perceptions today. And also, you know, part of the broader work that the Committee for Perth does, 2 years ago, we did the Perth Reputation Study to really understand perceptions of Perth as a place to live, work, study, invest and visit. And we get a lot of richness from this data as well in terms of building on those perceptions and giving us a sense of what has shifted and what has changed since we did that study in 2019, but also since the last Perth Perception Survey, which was in 2018. So in terms of the research that we conducted, it was in, so the research we did in terms of what we spoke about, lots of data that was collected, 26-minute survey in the end, and 600 people across Perth that we spoke to. Really critical in understanding a broad and representative sample. So it's the Greater Perth region in terms of where we speak to people. And that includes Peel, which is really important. So Greater Perth, we're not just talking about the CBD in the city, but all of the Perth metro area. Lots of areas that we covered, as I said, 26-minute survey. We had to play bad cop a little bit and try and contain the survey because there's so much that we like to cover and understand. And of course, the Committee for Perth has an incredibly broad remit and focus area. So I'll take you through what we found. It'll be a snapshot of the full report. But if there are other things that we can discuss in the question time, I really look forward to that. We'll cover as much as we can now, though. So what is life like in Perth today? if we start and we can have a look at our tracking data. So this is just the question of, how satisfied are you with living in Perth? And this was, as we mentioned, to all Perth residents that we spoke to, 600 of them. And we've increased the sample since we first did the research. So we can see when we look at that tracking data, a bit of a trend where from where we started in 2016 and we had 60% of Perth residents saying they're extremely satisfied, that moved up to 73% in 2015. And then we saw it come back and retract a little bit in 2018 to 60%, almost exactly back to where we were in 2012. So if we have a look at where we landed this year in 2021, and we're seeing that almost 3-yearly cycle come back again, where we've now got 67% of Perth residents again telling us that they're feeling satisfied with living in Perth, so in that 8 to 10 out of 10 in terms of satisfaction. So quite an interesting trend in those, now that we have our 4 3-yearly cycles. We can see 2015 improving, some retraction in 2018, and now some improvement again in 2021. Why do people live in Perth? Really interesting to watch this data over time, and it has stayed really quite consistent. So the top reasons for living in Perth are very consistent with what we saw in 2018, and that's family connections. For nearly 1 in 2 people that do live in Perth, it's family that is really bringing them and keeping them here. Lifestyle, really critical. 44% of Perth residents tell us it's about the lifestyle, and linked to that is the climate. Despite it being chilly yesterday, of course, we do have really beautiful temperate weather, which is very enjoyable. So lifestyle and climate, very important. And they're in 4th place for just a quarter. Is it about business and work opportunities? And certainly we saw in the Perth Reputation study, we did see that when it comes to work and invest, there are some challenges potentially with the perception of the offer in Perth. And so here this lines up a bit, that it's that 4th reason for people telling us that they do live in Perth. That's been very consistent with 2018. Where we've seen some difference though, and a shift, is the increase in people telling us that the reason they live in Perth is because it's a safe environment. And we can see this is up to 26% from 20% in 2018. And when we were reviewing the questionnaire, we tossed up the idea, should we put something in a bit more explicit about safety and perceptions of safety linked to COVID? We decided to keep it consistent, not ask a different question, but certainly if we think about our perceptions of safety, they have absolutely changed over the past couple of years, or the past 12 months, really, with the onset of COVID, and since we saw the last research in 2018. So we can take some information from this and really assume that that increase in safe environment being a reason for living in Perth, we can link that to COVID. And certainly it's been well highlighted just how safe we have been compared to the rest of the country, and also, of course, the rest of the world. So really a strengthening there around safety. We always ask the question, thinking about Perth, are things changing for the better or the worse? We know that change can be divisive, it can be polarizing, and really wanting to understand perceptions of Perth. Are we evolving? Are we changing? Is that a good thing? So the last time we did the research in 2018, we could see 2/3 were telling us that they feel like Perth is either staying the same or changing for the better. But there was a third, pretty chunky proportion feeling that things were actually getting worse in Perth. And remembering we did see some retraction in 2018 in terms of overall satisfaction with living in Perth. 2021, and we're seeing some strengthening. So up to 78% feeling that things are either staying the same or getting better, and a drop to just a 1/5. So that 22% feeling that things are getting worse, changing for the worse in Perth. And this improvement that we saw up to 78%, that was mostly driven by an increase in people feeling that things were getting better. So the proportion feeling that it was staying the same was quite stable, but we saw an increase in the number of people living in Perth who felt things were changing for the better. In understanding that change, we ask an open-ended question, so respondents can tell us anything, and they can type anything into that box. So it's really their own words. We then go through everything that they write and we put it into some buckets and we theme it to help us understand it. So the key reasons for feeling that things have changed for the better: really strong urban developments and the types of things that were mentioned, the stadium, the museum, just an increase in general entertainment districts coming through. So this idea of urban developments really helping and improving life in Perth. Infrastructure as well, really strong there at 28% of those 78%. So roads, public transport, cycleways, increased shopping mall, and those sorts of infrastructure investments really coming through and being felt. And general growth was a strong theme. And this, what we've put together here is, these themes of we've got a strong economy, we've got population growth, low unemployment, and high standards of living, which is really the ultimate outcome of growth. If we can grow and maintain these elements, that should make it comfortable growth and good growth. So we can see for 20% of that 78%, they felt that growth was a good thing. But always, we know there's some polarization and people differ based on their experiences and their perceptions. So for the 22% that do feel things are changing for the worse, social issues was the number one issue. So related to that, crime, drug use, homelessness, antisocial behaviour. So that critical issue. And the converse from what we saw in terms of why things are getting better, we see growth cited for why things are actually changing for the worse. And that's the inverse. So a sense that, yes, we're growing, but actually we're not taking everyone with us. There's an increase in unemployment. There's a rise in inequality. And certainly from the global work we do, we know the rise in inequality is increasing in importance across markets. And so we're seeing that reflected here amongst our Perth residents. And then the final piece, cost of living. So a sense of the essentials really increasing it and making it a less satisfying or a less enjoyable place to live. But overall, for the most, things are getting better, but we need to keep an eye on those things which are causing some pain for some parts of the population. So in terms of one of our favourite questions, and it's always a favourite of the media, we ask another open-ended question to our Perth residents. We say, well, if you were Premier for a day, what is it that you would do? What would you focus on? What are the biggest things that you think should really be addressed? And again, they could type anything they like here. So we've got the top responses here, and again, we've themed them. So the number one response that came through from 12% of Perth residents was around the cost of living. So really trying to reduce those costs, utilities, affordable housing, day-to-day costs, trying to really reduce those costs. And we can see in 2018, that was at 17%. So it's still here at number one, but it's eased a little bit in terms of those numbers. Healthcare as well came in at number two from 10%. Now, arguably, certainly public pressure on healthcare and our healthcare system has increased since we completed field work. So arguably this could be higher if we were to conduct the research today. But it still came out at number two at 10% of people saying that was the one area that they would focus on, and tied there with infrastructure and transport. So improving our public transport, more heavy rail, cross-city links, etc., reducing congestion. And then we flow through to the rest that make up the top there: social issues, general government and policy making, environment, employment, and our justice system. Our results were somewhat similar to 2018, but some of the numbers were just lower. And we actually found overall these numbers were quite low compared to particularly 2015, when there was one really big issue really bringing everyone together, and that was transport and infrastructure. We had nearly, I think it was 48% of Perth residents identifying transport and infrastructure as the one thing they would focus on in 2015. Fast forward 6 years to 2021, and we've got a real spread of issues. And as I mentioned, no one issue standing out, and those numbers a bit smaller. So, 12 being the highest area that anyone was really focusing on, 12%. So quite a spread, no one major issue dominating. We ask some questions. So we have a list, I think it's about 25 or 30 statements where we show residents, and we ask them, first of all, looking at each of these areas, how much do each of these characterise life in Perth today? And they're things like having a mining-focused economy, having strong government, having an attractive climate to live in. And we bucket them up from here. We're looking at economy and stability as well as lifestyle. And so we asked that question to start with: to what extent do each of these represent life in Perth today? And here we can see in blue our data from 2018. And if we overlay our data from 2021, we can see lots of these triangles, which tell us it's a significant shift, statistically speaking. So it's something that's not just a fluctuation in the data, it's a significant movement. Lots of blue triangles. So it means there's things compared to 2018 that we've kind of really doubled down on, and have a perception even more so compared to 2018 that these really characterise life in Perth today. And it's quite telling where we're seeing some of the strongest shifts. The strongest shift, 40 points, is in terms of perceptions of having a strong and effective government. This is no surprise. We've seen a lot of polling before the election, after the election, in the lead up to the election, around public support for the government, and certainly driven by a very strong COVID response. So we can see a 40-point shift in terms of perceptions from Perth residents that we have a strong and effective government. Some other shifts as well. So having a mining and resources focused economy, we see a strong increase there as well, to sort of 70% nearly of Perth residents now feeling we do have a mining and resources focused economy. And of course, we know there's a lot of focus on having a diverse economy. So strong perceptions, yes, we have a strong economy. And we've also seen an improvement in perceptions of having a diverse economy. But we've really lent into this mining and resources focused economy, which makes a lot of sense. We've seen and heard a lot about it. There's been a strong focus and a lot of conversation and narrative around the importance of the resources sector to Australia, not only Western Australia, but to Australia, as it's managed the economic fallout of COVID. So definitely echoing back in terms of perceptions of Perth residents. We're feeling much more confident in government compared to 3 years ago, really leaning into this resources economy, but feeling that we have actually potentially strengthened that diversification. Some other interesting areas. So what else has shifted? In line with that metric we saw earlier, here we also have what extent do we agree that Perth is a safe place to live? So we can see even more so compared to 3 years ago. So again, really aligning. But what's also quite interesting, if we think, yes, we've been less affected than other parts of the world and other parts of Australia, but there has still been this shift to working from home, remote working, less commuting, less time in offices. And it seems that we're really embracing this lower density living. So we're seeing an increase in perceptions compared to 3 years ago that we've got the right mix of high and low density living. But we're also seeing an increase in perceptions that commute times are fine. And this idea that potentially we're not having to really manage Perth being too spread out, no increase in perception here. So if we think there's been a strong focus in the past of trying to shrink down that sprawl, the urban sprawl, and really contain that and shift towards higher density, and we're just seeing some trends in the data that because potentially when in offices less, we're feeling less of that commute pain, some of that heat may have come off that issue, which of course has implications for planning and growth in the future. So how do we try and get back to some of that momentum around increasing density, which has many benefits in terms of livability and opportunities, etc. So we're seeing that softening, really reflecting the impact of COVID. We took all of those 30 or so attributes and we put them into a driver model. We do some modelling to understand, well, of all of those, what is actually most linked to actually making people satisfied or not satisfied with living in Perth? So we end up with all of those attributes rank ordered, and here we're just focusing on the top 10 or so. And it's really quite interesting. And, certainly we've seen from past studies and the Perth Reputation study that we are really strong and focused and driven by our beautiful natural environment, the climate here, the lifestyle we can have here. But some of those other elements in terms of, business, investment, education have really not come to the fore in terms of what drives us and our satisfaction and what Perth is known for. And we've really seen this come through again this year, and arguably even more so. So you can just see through that colour coding what is driving satisfaction with living in Perth. It's the lifestyle, the people, the closest we come to, I guess, any sort of infrastructure or economy or business type metric is being seen as a safe place to live. So very important coming through there. But otherwise, it's really these elements of lifestyle and our society, which can be linked to the fact we've all certainly had a lot more time to experience life in Perth and WA more broadly over the last 12 months, but really coming through that it's these areas around lifestyle and community that are the strongest reasons for feeling satisfied with living in Perth. We collected a little bit more data to look specifically at the impact of COVID. And this was asking really around what are your perceptions of how each of these entities have managed the recovery from COVID? Not surprising, but just to see the numbers is really interesting. So 90% of all the people we spoke to across the Greater Perth region said that the government had done a really strong job, a positive job in managing COVID. Not surprising, but 90%, very, very strong. Next strongest was Australian businesses. And it's been really interesting in the work that we do more broadly to understand what is the opportunity around COVID for business in terms of their social license, the impact they can have, how they can help in a time of crisis. And we've seen this quite consistently. And Australia's been different to a lot of other markets around the world. We've been largely and consistently very satisfied with government and business in terms of the response to COVID. So this does reflect that, but I think particularly here in WA, those state government numbers are stronger than what we see elsewhere. So businesses at 80%, our own employer. So we do feel most of us have been looked after by our employers. And then the federal government, they're still very high at 76% approval in terms of the response to COVID. We also collected, there's a lot of data on this slide, but a lot of different measures. And again, this is some research that we do globally, looking at, well, what's the impact of COVID been on you as an individual? What's first most interesting, if we see here, 41% of people in Perth tell us, well, none of these apply to me. And these are things like I've lost my job, someone in the household has lost their job, I've had to delay or cancel big purchases, etc. So we can see here the 2 in 5 Perth residents, no impact from COVID. And the highest we're getting is at 21%. That's delaying purchases, having enough money in an emergency fund, using savings to pay bills. Breaking this down by age is quite interesting. So we've got 3 age cohorts. And interestingly, despite from a health perspective being the most vulnerable to COVID, it's our 55 plus cohort who are the most likely to say, actually, none of these have applied to me in terms of the impact of COVID. And it's the 16 to 34 age group who are the most likely to have some of the negative impacts. So reduced hours, needing government assistance, salary being reduced, etc. So some interesting trends when we do look at that by age, but overall quite moderate in terms of the impact of COVID being reported. And this aligns to the future of work research that we did for the Committee for Perth later last year, which looked at the really broad impacts of COVID and whether that had sped up the impact of technology and some of those challenges that may be coming to the future of work. So this does align that certainly those impacts have been somewhat muted in terms of that experience here in Perth. When do we feel that we're going to get back to normal? So the patterns here really follow the global experience, despite our experience being so different in terms of the actual impacts, health and economic, of COVID. We have a very similar pattern in terms of when we think things will return to normal, which is a phrase which is obviously heavily laden. But the bulk feel, it sits in this 6 months to a bit over 2 years in terms of when we feel we're going to return to normal. And very low levels, feeling that we're never going to return to normal. So that pessimism is pretty under control, which of course makes sense for our experience, but we're very aligned with the rest of the world, with most of us thinking 6 months to 2 years in terms of returning to some kind of normalcy. We always focus heavily on work and career and business opportunities in Perth because it's so closely linked to drawing population, keeping population, having that whole, all elements of life satisfied by living in Perth. So we focus a little bit more on career. I'm just giving myself a time check. I'll try and speed through to make sure we keep lots of time for discussion. So here just looking at propensity to stay in Perth in the short to medium term. Really consistent with 2018, slight strengthening if we look for a bit of a movement there. So we've got that 82% in 2021 telling us they plan to stay in Perth for the long term. 29% leave for a little while, but come back to live eventually. And then just 13% who say they'll leave at some stage and don't want to return. And we do see that propensity to leave strongest amongst the younger cohorts, which makes sense with a lot of that desire to leave, which we'll see being driven by work opportunities, and lowest amongst our older populations. So reasons for leaving Perth, as I said, here in the blue is the 2018 data. And we've seen quite consistently that it's work opportunities that are really pushing people out of Perth, followed by family reasons, a desire to travel broadly and to live and experience other places. So we've seen that. And as I mentioned before, the Perth Reputation study showed us that our business, our invest, our work offer didn't quite stack up to some of our other offers. Living here is great, but there was this perception of there being a trade-off when it comes to career opportunities. So when we look at 2018, 2021 rather, we have the same pattern. But what we see is the dominance of leaving because of work opportunities has dropped away. So it's still at the top, tied with number 2 for family reasons, but its dominance has dropped away. And we can read into that. So arguably, has there been an improvement in Perth's work offer since 2018? Hopefully, yes. And there's, a lot of data the committee looks at to really understand shifts and trends in employment data and industry. So some of that potentially a strengthening of the actual offer, but arguably as well, we know there's been this COVID-fueled shift to working remotely, working from home. So does that mean there's more opportunity to live in Perth, enjoy the lifestyle that we have, and work remotely, arguably to anywhere in the country or the world? There may be some of that coming into play as well. The other shift that we have seen is a decrease in a perception that it's more expensive to live in Perth compared to those perceptions in 2018. This may be rising. We know there's certainly housing pressure at the moment, but a drop away compared to 2018 of people saying they're leaving because of the cost of living here. And just this strengthening in terms of our work offer and those employment and business related measures. We can see that across some other measures too. So yes, there's been broad strengthening of Perth residents being willing to recommend Perth as a place to live. But where we see some of the strongest gains is around these work and business ones. So recommend as a place to work, a place to find a new job, a place to start a business. So compared to 2018, really nice positive shifts across these measures. And these are some of the strongest shifts we've seen. So again, giving us some evidence potentially of a strengthening of that work offer and or people being able to live here and really fulfill and not have to have that trade-off. We have a lot of measures from 2018. We wanted to understand job security and also appetite for risk and entrepreneurialism. I won't go into too much detail, but what we've seen, nice to see that despite the impact of COVID, we've actually still seen a strengthening in perceptions of job security and that appetite for risk in terms of starting your own business, working for someone, working for yourself rather than an employer. We can see that either stabilizing or actually getting stronger. So despite the impact of COVID, some good signs in terms of how we're feeling about our current employment, our future employment, and that risk taking around business. Appetite for further study. We covered a lot of ground in the study, so I'm pushing us through pretty quick now. So 28% of Perth residents, there was an interest in studying further. And what we did find in the future of work studies, there wasn't a strong recognition of the looming impact of technology and linked to that, the need to upskill, to retrain. So we're interested to look at this again. So how many in Perth actually feel they have a desire to study and for further study? So 28%. And in terms of all the reasons, a lot about, growth, development, nothing specific around threat of technology, need to stay current, need to pick up new skills in order to stay employed. That wasn't a strong narrative still and aligns again, as I say, with what we saw last year in the future of work study. Industries that are most appealing. So we gave a whole list of industries, which of these are most appealing and least appealing to work in. Some are really polarizing, like mining, in terms of those who find it appealing compared to those who don't, similarly government. But the ones that really stand out as ticking boxes in terms of appeal for future employment, wanting to work in health and community services and cultural and recreational services, compared to those that really fall to have the least appeal, construction, retail, trade and finance and insurance. So quite interesting, those perceptions amongst Perth residents. And similarly, we asked the question of all these industries, which do you feel the most future focused? And we gave a bit more of a description there, not just future focus. We said they're most likely to have growth in the future and maintain growth. Really telling, remembering we've seen this leaning into that mining and resources economy, 52% of Perth residents rated mining as the most future focused industry amongst this really long list. So despite there being, some narrative around the future and sustainability and the need for evolution within a traditional or fossil fuels related resources industry, really strong perceptions from those in Perth that this is a future focused industry. How are we managing our growth? So just a quarter of Perth residents say they're aware of population growth predictions to get to 3.5 million by 2050. And the key takeout here is most feel we're not prepared in terms of managing this growth. And remember, we've seen a lot of change and people have grappled with that over time in terms of Perth residents. Most of us are feeling things have changed for the better, but we can see some apprehension when this number of 3.5 is put in front of people, some concern around how prepared we are for growth. We dug into as well retail trade, deregulation of retail trade hours. We'd seen in some previous data, which I'm not showing you at the moment, just that there was a sense that that had helped Perth, and one of the things that had really improved Perth, the deregulation to date. And what we see also in terms of the proposed changes to retail trading hours, strong support. So more than 50% supporting, and around that quarter to a fifth opposed. And that does increase with age, but it's actually the middle age group who are sometimes called that sandwich group, who are challenged with working long hours, often having young children and aging parents at the same time. So they're the most likely to be in favour of these changes. The future, very quickly wrap up. So we have that same list of attributes, and we ask the question, we've already asked you how much these attributes characterise Perth now, but what about the future? How important are these attributes to the future of Perth? And we can see not a lot of shift from 2018, just a strengthening here, consistent with that pattern around the importance of a future focused on a mining and resources economy. So that's increased. Otherwise, a lot of stability. Here we do see some decreases across some of these measures. So addressing the geographical spread, having a suitable range of housing choices, access to public transport and acceptable commute times. So that point we made earlier, an easing of some of these concerns, a shift away from what we had seen, which was a sort of an acceptance of increased density, trying to stop the urban sprawl. We're definitely seeing that easing. So important to watch that as we go forward, because we know public support for increased density is critical for it to work, and that full story of the increased amenity that can come from that. So we're seeing that easing. And just the very final piece, something we've done in previous studies, just looked at the gap. So if we look at perceptions of what characterises us now compared to what's most important for the future, and just take the one away from the other, we end up with the list of, what do we see as most important for our future, but least characterised as who we are now. And this gives us our top 10. And it's quite telling in terms of those focus areas going forward. So affordability, critical, that's been quite consistent over time. But here we see this aged care and healthcare really coming through as critical for future focus. Equal access to opportunities, inequality, as I mentioned earlier, rising globally as a challenge. So it's coming through here. World-class education there as well. Effective public transport, diverse economy, to be a leader in energy transition. We had some other data in there that focused on energy transition, broad support for energy transition and the role for WA in that, but some concern about how we balance that with having a thriving resources industry. So potentially some information gap there. Being willing to evolve and being technologically advanced, which we know is critical, and an opportunity area for Perth in terms of future industry and growth, and ensuring our population stays employed and relevant as technology potentially increases the disruption in the employment space. So they're the top 10. That was a very quick run through. As I said, there's lots of data there, hopefully some good discussion to follow.
Sally, thank you so much for so many insights. Thank you everyone who joined us, members, directors of Committee for Perth, guests and the media. Really enjoyed today's presentation discussion. Thank you for those who participated in the questions, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.